Well, my friends, welcome back to our music moment for this fine week we've just completed. I hope you're having a great day and looking forward to the weekend. But first, we need to learn about the Baroque era and the music from that era. So, here we go. The Renaissance era ended and the Baroque began on March 25th, 1600 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. No other history of music has the courage to make this statement with such conviction. I just wanted to set the record straight and clear up any lingering misunderstanding. The Renaissance hung around for a few more decades in England, but on the European continent it was all washed up. Listeners had grown tired of hearing the same old polyphony of the so-called ars perfecta, or perfect art, to be found in the music of Josquin, Palestrina, and the rest of that crowd. We already heard about them. They wanted something new to listen to, and composers were willing to oblige since they were running out of things to say in an old idiom anyway. Claudio Monteverdi was one of the leading lights in the change from the old style to the new. He referred to the old polyphonic style as the first practice. My dog is so upset right now. His newer style of music he called the second practice. Max agrees. He told everybody that one of these days he would write a book explaining all about his views on the subject. Monteverdi was born in 1567 in Cremona, a little town in the north of Italy. Cremona was a pretty place to live. The houses were large and graceful, the streets wide and straight, but musically it was a bit of a bore. Not exactly as exciting as Mantua or Ferrara or Venice. Monteverdi's father, like Handel's after him, was a barber surgeon who later became a physician. Oh, Sarah's home. Monteverdi probably learned about music from singing in the Cremona Cathedral. Church musicians were not as prestigious as musicians as the royal courts, but they were higher on the social ladder than the town minstrels, or piffari, whose job was to follow the mayor around and blow trumpets just before he said anything important or cut a ribbon or something. Evidently, Monteverdi learned well because he published his first book of motets when he was only 15. They were written for only 3 voices, which is not so difficult as 4 voices, but was still something to be proud of. By the time he turned 20, Monteverdi had published 5 books of motets and madrigals in 5 years. These were written in the old-fashioned style, but he was just warming up. Obviously, Cremona was getting too small for his talents. So in 1591, Monteverdi packed a bag and set for Mantua, where he became a composer at the court of Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga. Gonzaga. How about that? Vincenzo's father, Guglielmo, had been a keen patron of the arts, and his court had attracted fine musicians and artists from across Europe. Vincenzo wasn't half the man his father was, at least when it came to appreciating good music. He was a bit of a cad. In fact, a womanizer and a gabbler. When he grew tired of his first wife, he had divorced her on the grounds that she was deformed. He didn't specify how. Her family countered that he was an impotent old so-and-so. Vincenzo then suggested a test for his virility and with any virgin girl in Venice. For some reason, the matter was dropped. Despite his character flaws, Vincenzo did like music, if only as a means of impressing his mistresses. Once he planned an elaborate spectacle with music, costumes, fancy tapestries, and lots of good food, just to please his Spanish mistress, Agnes de Argati. But everything was canceled when she said she was bored with the idea. Monteverdi was kept composing for Vincenzo. There was a concert every Friday in the Great Hall of Mirrors. In 1592, Vincenzo took his army across the Alps to help Austria fight off the attacking Turks, and Monteverdi went along for the ride, although he didn't enjoy it very much. The fighting, however, impressed him so much that many years later he wrote a book of warlike madrigals. Part of Monteverdi's annoyance came from having to pay many of his traveling expenses out of his own pocket. Nowadays, that sort of expense would be considered a legitimate tax deduction. In 1600, a music theorist named Giovanni Artusi published an attack on modern music, which he thought was totally incomprehensible. Artusi complained that new composers were breaking all the established rules laid down after centuries of noble tradition. Although he didn't name Monteverdi specifically, it was pretty obvious to everyone who he was complaining about. Monteverdi didn't seem to mind. He went on composing just the same. A few years later, Artusi published another attack, this time naming names. Monteverdi wasn't about to give in. Quite the contrary. He went so far as to develop a whole new style of music which marked the beginning of opera. His music drama, Orfeo, of 1607 could be considered the first true opera, although the idea had come from the early writings of Vincenzo Galliali, father of the astronomer Galileo. How about that? Who was the champion of what he called the representative style. Galliali thought that this music style of composition was a return to ancient Greek ideals of music. He had no proof for the theory, since he had no real indication of what Greek music sounded like, but the idea sounded impressive. The year 1607 was a good one in other respects. The Italians were just beginning to understand the proper use of forks at the dinner table. Things were looking up. A big break for Monteverdi came in 1610 when he got the plum job of Maestro di Cappella at St. Mark's, the biggest and richest church in Venice. He was paid 300 ducats a year, which was more money than he'd ever seen in his life, and 100 ducats more than the previous maestro had received. The job kept him busy. He supervised a choir of about 50 singers and instrumentalists and had to prepare and compose music for some 40 major church festivals each year. Venetians knew how to party, and everyone went there for a good time, sort of like Vegas. Monteverdi loved his new job, which offered him creative status and a steady income. When the Mantuan Duke tried to offer him his old job back, Monteverdi was quick to refuse. It's just as well he didn't return to Mantua. Not long afterwards, members of the Gonzaga family and the imperial army got into an argument over who should have control of the dukedom. The whole city was sacked and the soldiers infected everybody with the plague. It was no longer a fun place to be. Monteverdi escaped the plague, but old age finally got him when he was 75. The city clerk got his age wrong on the death certificate, but it was too late to make any difference. Ladies and gentlemen, you have yourself a great weekend. We will see you next week when we learn about Vivaldi. Now we're getting somewhere, some names that you just might have heard of. Have a good weekend. We'll see you next time.